Yeah, I mean that product management form was a first of its kind.
Mhm.
I don't know any other project that actually had such a concept, and it was interesting to watch. And at the time as well, I mean, OpenStack was, as far as I'm aware, the busiest and most. It was just the most active project with the most
Correct.
organizations trying to get so much done at the same time. So that kind of balance of doing what you need to for yourself versus what you need to do for the project to move things along. That was hard for a lot of the leadership of the OpenStack project. I could sit back and watch that struggle that they had.
It was it's a really interesting challenge in how it went. I agree with you. I've met and I talk to OpenStack people all the time. What we created in the community, and still is there, was unique in the way the community operated and people's shared interest in how things were going. It's not present in communities the same way that I've seen. Like there's a lot of great people in the Kubernetes community, but they don't feel like a cohesive community in the same way that OpenStack felt. At the same time, we created a lot of bizarre fiefdoms out of the project structures, and a lot of gamification in how those projects were working. That ultimately made it slowed things down. It created a lot of polarization. That sort of started that tide turned, if you will. But yeah, I would remember having trying to influence a project lead to pick up a feature set or something like that. Or oh boy, I distinctly remember who was it? I was on a bus in Paris, hearing about how great Keystone was, the auth service, and all these cool features they've added. It was amazing, and it was. They did this great stuff because they had this vision that Keystone would be a standalone project for doing auth. I mean, even as a board member at the time, I'm like, but there's other projects that are dependent on Keystone to deliver these features to move those projects forward. He's like, I know, but I've got the potential to be a standalone auth project, and that's a weird tension within the project, right? Are you servicing your project and what could happen in this, or are you servicing the needs of how the integrated whole would work? And you're right, we were really unique with the product management forum, but at the end of the day, we didn't have any clout to help Keystone, or all these projects have similar things, make sort of a your priority list actually needs to be in service of the group. And all the people were well intentioned and they listened and they tried to do those things, but it only takes 2 or 3 developers in a project to show up and be like, I really want to work on these, in an open source project, I really want to work on these features, to pull a project momentum somewhere else. They flood the queue with patch requests for feature development that is not maybe the direction that you thought you were going.
Yeah. Back to like what you said. I mean, having fiefdoms, but having a lot of interdependencies between the modules. Right.
It was a very hard design, and we when we started it, there was a thought that it would let 2-pizza team type of thing and let people run. And like one of the things that happened with Keystone is that Rackspace was like, we got this, we're going to fund Keystone, and they sent it off to some outsourced developers that they had working on the thing who didn't like the design and just basically threw a whole bunch of stuff out. And I think tried to write it in Java or I don't know. It was crazy. And it took I think 2 release cycles to get that sort of straightened out. And that was, we used to argue about benevolent dictators or not, and that type of thing. And there is no benevolent dictator in OpenStack. There's times when that type of singular authority can force you to say, I'm not, if you keep working in this area, we're not going to take these pulls, and shut down work for that. A consensus is very hard to do. Very, very hard to do.
Yeah, particularly given the size. Yeah.
And separating into little projects is one way to make consensus work, because you got into it. You don't have to have this big argument. You can have the controls, but it doesn't drive consensus. Doesn't necessarily drive things together. And that's like one of the just a little news of the day comment, right? Some of the thing that's interesting with the HashiCorp fork, right? Open Terraform now has a ton of multiple people chasing what it should be. That might be great. It might drive that project faster, because HashiCorp was not, moving it as quickly as it might move now. But at the same time, HashiCorp had a vision and a direction. They made this, they controlled that, and it'll be interesting to see that. We're about to witness that balance of a lot of enthusiasm and developers and ideas coming into a project. And it's not as clear yet if how they're going to say no. One of my lessons at Dell, I don't want to tell too many stories, but one of my lessons when I was at Dell, everybody thinks of these big organizations as like behemoths who can't do anything and they're slow and all this bureaucracy. And what I found at Dell was that the thing that they had to be really good at, that's hard, is they have to say no to stuff. They were brilliant people with great ideas, tons of opportunities, easy paths to market, but they could only do so much stuff effectively. And so the thing they really had to do is be much better at saying no than average. And that's not a discipline that, people are used to having. We have a tendency to want to say yes in open source projects. Oh, yes, you're bringing your talents, do what you want to do. And in a lot of cases, no is actually the most effective answer for everybody involved.
Well, it's a balance, right? I mean, that's exactly it. That's one of the interesting things for me in open source communities that work well is, I've always found the belief that as long as you're not doing something detrimental to some other portion of the community, even if nobody else wants what it is you're building, go ahead and do it. And there may very well be network effects that end up playing off nicely.
The challenge is that there also might be code that breaks other things and isn't documented, and is somebody's dragging things forward that's not doesn't have a long-term maintenance strategy in it. So I agree with you, and I guess as I've come along, I see open source projects with a ton. There's two things. One is they have a ton of partially finished things. I mean, products do too. Don't get me wrong. But that there's a lot of that. And then the question I've been asking a lot recently is just how much can open source fix architectural issues and change architecture? Because it's very difficult for an open source project to reconsider its architectural work inside of its own framework. Those end up being either forks or rewrites, and they're.
And it depends, right? I mean, that is a cultural aspect, I would say, of an open source project. I'm going to go back to Linux as one that's been refactored more times than you can shake a stick at, right? Because Linus feels that way, right? I mean, he'll say, well, okay, this release, we're not doing anything except totally refactoring the networking subsystem because you guys and your wireless drivers are ticking me off because nothing works.
And you get something like systemd, which people have a lot of feelings about, but converged systems management across the board in a really important way, and that was an incredibly divisive change that took actually a lot of political capital to get through the system. And I still hear people whining about it. You're right, and it was interesting because I talked to our CTO about systemd, and he's like, I absolutely hate it, and it's the best thing that ever happened to Linux. Because he's like, now I don't have to worry about which distro I'm using to figure out how to configure stuff and start services, which had been a nightmare, absolute nightmare. So, and that's for me, that's actually, I often will look back to the Linux community because the ability to take technical excellence
and drive to specific decisions. I mean, Linus talks about, we got a lot of lieutenants. It'll be fine when I retire if I'm hit by a bus, right? He gets the hit by the bus question all the time. I'm not so sure. I mean, I give that community, I give him a lot of credit for the culture, because he got to build that for 10 years right before corporate interest. OpenStack didn't have that opportunity. No. There were a lot of deadlines that folks were trying to meet, not the least of which I was at HP at the time. I don't know if you know my history, but I was at HP when you were at Dell.
Okay.
In doing that work. And we were trying to get something stood up, right? We were back in those early days, we were trying to get public cloud stood up quickly. So deadlines really mattered to us.
Oh yeah.
And that was, again, a different culture, a different set. And that cultural change, I mean, that's what I find so very interesting about open source, because open source is a license type. It's not a collaborative development type, right? And so
there's no instructions on the collaboration.
Exactly. And we see a great spectrum, which is kind of the point behind this podcast for Ildiko and I, is to talk about what those differences are and cherry pick what are the best ones.
Yeah.
Right? What actually works. So, and OpenStack is a great example.
OpenStack's an amazing example.